All right, let's get right into it. We're about to decode one of the most common and honestly one of the most destructive glitches in the human operating system. And we're going to do it using a really powerful story and some ideas from a framework called governance physics. You know what I'm talking about, right? We've all been there. That moment of sharp, unexpected pain, and suddenly that poor, innocent table is your sworn enemy. You kick it, you yell at it, you react with a level of rage that, let's be honest, makes zero sense. Well, guess what? There's a name for that. It's called the wild horse effect. It's that exact moment when your emotions just bolt, dragging your logic and reason along for the ride and turning a tiny little problem into a potential catastrophe. To really get our heads around just how dangerous this is, we need to hear a story. So let's jump into a classic parable that perfectly, and I mean perfectly, illustrates the system failure in action. The scene is pretty simple. Imagine a snake, just doing its thing, moving through a carpenter's workshop. As it passes over a saw left on the floor, the saw does what saws do. The snake gets a little nick, a super minor physical event. The initial damage? It's almost nothing. And here is where it all starts to go wrong. Instead of just moving away from the hazard, the snake's primitive survival instinct completely hijacks its brain. It decides the saw is an attacker and it retaliates, only to end up hurting itself even more. And now, that wild horse is at a full-on gallop. The snake commits everything it has to destroying this thing it now sees as its enemy. It declares total, irrational war, wrapping its entire body around the very source of its own pain. And this brings us to the tragic end. The snake's own reaction, its own uncontrolled fury, is what ultimately kills it. The saw was just sitting there, completely passive. The snake's response, that was fatal. So what in the world just happened? So what exactly broke inside the snake's operating system? To figure this out, we're going to use this really interesting framework, governance physics, which sees these things not as just bad luck, but as actual system errors. And the very first error? It's a massive failure of perception. Okay, so this framework starts with a pretty wild idea. What if the physical world you see is kind of like a computer screen? You know, the things we see, tables, saws, even other people, they're like the icons on your desktop. They aren't the deep underlying code, they're just representations we're meant to interact with. The framework calls this perceived world the apparition, and the number one rule is, don't mistake the icon for the real thing. And this is the snake's huge initial mistake. It fell right into what's called the interface trap. It looked at the icon of the saw, a passive, non-living object, and it projected all this malicious, evil intent onto it. It treated a dead piece of metal like it was a conscious enemy. This is exactly what we do when we get mad at a table, or maybe when we read a really hostile tone into a perfectly neutral email and then launch a full-scale counterattack against an enemy who doesn't even exist. The snake's second failure was all about how it processed the data from that first little cut. It got an input, but then it ran the completely wrong program in response. Now, I know this looks like a complicated formula, but the idea is actually incredibly simple. The framework calls it the kitchen protocol. Think of it like this. E is the final outcome of any experience. U is just the raw event, what happens to you. But D squared, that's your response. It's your self-control, your wisdom. And that little squared symbol, that's the most important part. It means your response doesn't just add to the outcome, it multiplies it. It has a massive, outsized impact. So what's the right way to handle something bad that happens? Well, the framework suggests what it calls a pressing protocol. Just think about making juice. You have to pause, right? You look at the situation objectively, you extract the useful lesson, that's the juice, and then you have to consciously throw away all the useless emotional gunk, that's the peel. The snake, of course, did the complete opposite. Instead of extracting that simple life-saving juice, which was literally just, hey, this thing is sharp, I should probably move away, the snake just devoured the bitter peel. It choked on the pain, the insult to its ego, and this overwhelming need for revenge. It completely missed the critical information because it was so consumed by all that toxic baggage. Okay, so the snake confused the icon with reality, and then it ate the emotional peel instead of the useful juice. These mistakes have a direct physical effect on our internal system, which this framework describes in a really interesting way, using the language of physics. This is what that wild horse effect actually is, on the inside. The snake took a tiny localized problem, the cut. And through its own reaction, it created massive system-wide chaos. The framework calls this runaway entropy, but you can just think of it as a total system meltdown, where your insides are just flooded with noise, confusion, and panic. And this isn't just some abstract concept. Squeezing the saw is the perfect metaphor for what we do when we hold on to anger. We obsess over it, we resent it, we replay it in our minds. And what does this do? It floods our bodies with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, knocking our whole system out of balance and trapping our nervous system in a permanent state of emergency. We are, quite literally, squeezing the very thing that is cutting us. So if reacting like that is basically suicide, what's the alternative? Well, the solution is incredibly powerful, but it means we have to completely rethink what real strength actually looks like. This right here is the core lesson of the whole story. Real power isn't in the force of your bite or the strength of your squeeze. It's in the wisdom to disengage, to protect your own system above everything else. And this totally redefines free will. See, the snake couldn't control the fact that a saw was in its path. That was outside its capacity. Its entire power, its true free will, was in the one and only thing it could control, its response, and it chose self-destruction. So letting go isn't passive, it's not weak, it's actually the most profound act of power you can take. It's consciously hitting the pause button on that knee-jerk biological reaction. It's refusing to let a piece of metal, or a careless comment, or a frustrating day dictate your internal state. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation, of cognitive sovereignty. And that really just leaves us with one final question to think about. What about you? Think about the grudges you might be holding, the resentments you're replaying, those old injuries you just refuse to release. What saw are you still squeezing in your own life? And what might happen if you finally decided to just let it go?